this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I am reviewing this katana made by Z-Sey. Now, I bought this katana secondhand, and I don't know the exact price it sold for new. The person I bought it from doesn't remember. He thinks it was around $800 to $900. I reached out to Z-Sey to ask about it, and they didn't give me a price, and they also made sure to mention that this is not available anymore. It's a discontinued model. And they also said that they have improved since making this katana, which kind of implies a lack of confidence in it. Now, at the $800 to $900 price point, that would be what I would consider the low end of high-tier katana without going into the extremely high tier such as Motohara Evolution blades and the like. At this price point, there are quite a few competitors. You have things like the Hanwei Bamboo Mat, the Dragon King Tatsumaki katana, and some of the most expensive ones you can get from Huawei if you can manage to order one from them. The point being, there's a good number of competitors in this price point. All right, so Z-Sey. Now, I don't have any insider information about them. What I can say is that they are a company that is based out of Longchuan, China, like so many of the katana producers that are in the market today. They have a relationship with Dragon Sword, which has recently changed their name to Shadow Dancer. The two companies kind of work together quite a bit. For a little while, Z-Sey was not able to accept payments from PayPal and really weren't able to accept payments at all. So Dragon Sword was filling that gap for them. Z-Sey has managed to work out how to do that so that they can accept their own payments now. So you can once again order directly from Z-Sey rather than through Dragon Sword or Shadow Dancer. Now, Z-Sey has a lot of different katana that are all very expensive, frankly. There's only a few of these that are even below $1,000. You've got this Kochoji katana, that's hard to say. You've got a few bare blades that are below $1,000, but the majority of their swords range from around $1,000 to $2,000 up to $3,000 and $4,000. What do you get for that? Well, one of the things Z-Sey does better than pretty much anybody else on the market is the polish on their swords. I'm just going to take a look at a random one right here. And they, of course, have barely any pictures. Let's take a look at another one. So, yeah, they put on a heck of a polish on their swords, which is much more traditional and much more reminiscent of an actual Nihonto polish with Togishi. And you can see here they put quite a bit of effort into the overall look and appearance of the katana. Now, admittedly, this is a marketing picture, but in general, there's a lot more detail in their polish, a lot more attention and time put into it. That's one of the main reasons they are more expensive. One of the other things they do is they will put Hishigami into pretty much all of their katanas. I believe by default they have some Hishigami, but there might be some that are you can pay extra to get better Hishigami. I'm not sure of that. I might be getting them confused with Shadow Dancer, especially because I'm looking here and I'm not seeing any where you have the option of getting more a higher quality of Hishigami. It might be that they have changed and offer it on all of them now. But you can also see that you have the option of having them make a handmade saya specifically for your katana rather than taking one that is more mass produced. It adds a considerable amount of money and a lot of extra time. If I remember right, from what I've seen, it takes, it says if you take a handmade saya, it takes an additional 2 months. So keep that in mind. You can also get a lot of different fittings than just the ones they list. You can customize pretty much anything that they do. And from what I understand, pretty much any of the typical Longchuan fittings that you might find, you can get them for Z-Sey or have them acquire them and put them on your katana if you prefer that. Looking at the saya here, it is pretty simple. Red glossy lacquer, what looks like horn, koiguchi, and kodri, but is not. If you look here, it's actually just wood. And same for the kurigata. And the sageo is a pretty thick and nice feeling one. It feels better than most sageo you get on production katana. Overall, it's a nice saya. It's relatively slender, although it doesn't really taper in any dimension. It still maintains a slender profile. It's not big and bulky like a lot of saya you can get are. This is a better feeling one. And if we look at the fit here, there is absolutely no rattle whatsoever. I can hold it upside down, shake, it's not coming out at all. But if I just push with my thumb, it slides right out. Now, when you're drawing it, let me see if I can pick this up on the microphone. There is a little bit of a raspiness to it. It's not a perfectly smooth draw and sheath, but it's very close. It's actually quite nicely fitted here, and it draws and sheaths nicely. It could just be ever so slightly nicer. Now, I do think at this price point, the koiguchi, kurigata, and kojiri should be made from buffalo horn, not just wood. It's a more premium option, but it doesn't add a lot of cost. And at this price point, I think it should be included. Let's take a look at the hilt, starting with the koshirae. I believe this is made from blackened brass. I would think either that or iron, but it does not react to a magnet, so I'm guessing it's brass. The design is floral, and it's kind of got this stippled texture to the surface underneath the floral design, and I really like that textured surface. Unfortunately, the casting quality here is what I would consider subpar at this price point. The lines are not crisp, it's rather muddy all over the place, and if you look here where they cleaned up the casting lines, it's just a mess. You know, this is what I would consider to be approximately what you would normally see on a $200, $300 Long Chuan katana, not something 3 to 4 times that price. This is somewhere that should have been improved, and hopefully that's something that they have improved on, like they said they have improved. Now, the good thing is the koshirae is completely tight. There is no looseness whatsoever, and that's a good thing. That's something that goes wrong on a lot of cheaper katana. And the transitions to the ito are absolutely perfect. There's no ledges anywhere, just a very nice, even, smooth transition. The ito is leather, and it's got a slightly tacky or grippy feel to it that I really like. The diamonds are pretty well shaped. They vary a little bit here and there, but not a whole lot. And the end knot is a little bit bulky, but I think that's more a function of the fact that leather ito is a little bulkier than cotton and silk, so it's going to make a slightly bigger knot no matter what. Now, the tightness of the ito is a little bit lackluster. I can move it around pretty easily without very much effort at all. And to compare this to some other ito that is also leather, here is my Huawei that has been customized by Josh at Cottontail Customs. Now, I want to stress that Josh is somebody who has done a ton of ito wrapping. I don't think he would call himself an expert at it, but I would call him an expert. And I don't expect this level of tightness on this price of a sword. It would be nice, that's for sure, but it's just not a realistic expectation, honestly. But at the same time, I have katana in the sub $300 price range that have tighter ito than this. So this is something that could be improved and I think should be improved. You can see when I move the knots around, there's no hishigami used on this. I believe that is a standard for Z-Sey now. So that I'm sure I would hope would help with the tightness overall. To talk about how the tightness affects the handling of the sword, or rather how the looseness of the ito affects the handling, check out the handling section of my review where I go into that in a lot more detail. Looking at the parts underneath the ito, the manuki are a little bit loose, not a terrible amount. They look like they are made of brass and are, I believe, a lion dog design. And the nice thing is they're different. You know, Manuki are not supposed to be identical. They're supposed to have some differences, and these two are different. That's a nice touch. There is only one Makugi, which is traditional for katana, especially Nihonto, but it's not something you see a lot of on reproduction katana. Generally, the makers like to put two in, probably because they lack confidence in securing everything with just one. I like to see just one. It's a nice statement that this katana is made well. The Samegawa is real, and there are some larger nodules. It looks like there might be an emperor node, but it's directly underneath one of the knots, so you don't really get to see it. That said, the panels are quite nice, and they are inlaid into the Tsuka core as they should be. The Tsuka core is pretty simple shaped. There's not really much depth to it. There's not really any wasting, anything like that. It's a very simple Tsuka core, but it works very well. The Fuchi continues the floral design from the koshirae, and unfortunately continues the rather lackluster casting quality. Luckily, the place where they cleaned up the casting lines is not as bad as on the koshirae. And just like the koshirae, the transitions to the Ito are perfect, and it is completely tight. There is no looseness or wiggle in the Fuchi at all. Those two pieces very often come loose on Mongchuan China katana, so I'm very glad to see that they are nice and tight and properly fitted to the blade here. The Tsuba combines the themes of the Fuchi, koshirae, and Manuki in that it's mostly floral, but there's also a lion dog on there. I really like to see that kind of cohesive whole to the theming. Now the casting quality on the Tsuba, exactly like the Fuchi and koshirae, a little bit lackluster, could be improved. I do like to see that there's a rim around the Tsuba, and then I really like the stippled texture on it. It really gives it more depth to when you look at the Tsuba. It's also nice that they have different designs on two sides, and the hilt side is the more elaborate one, which is traditional for a katana. That's the side that would be facing out when you're wearing it, so that's the flashier side. There's really not much of anything to say about the seppa. They are copper and your standard Longchuan design. I do like that they're copper because I think copper is a better looking material than brass, so that's a very minor bonus to me. The habaki is also copper, and this is not standard for Longchuan. Now, while the design is, you'll see this on a lot of katana from there, the attention to detail on this habaki is not at all standard. This is a very well fitted habaki to the katana. It fits to the blade very nicely. There's very tiny gaps where it meets the katana, but it also encapsulates the katana properly, where it sticks out a little bit above the mune, and it encapsulates the edge as well. This is all done to protect the blade from when you're drawing and sheathing it from the saya, so the blade is not rubbing against the koiguchi. It's the habaki that is, and it's something you rarely see on katana, that reproduction katana. Most of the time, especially on the mune sticks out from the habaki, which is just not the proper way to construct it. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So this katana weighs in at 2 pounds 7 ounces and is 39 inches long overall, with a blade that's just under 28 inches long. It starts at 1¼ inches wide with gentle profile taper, ending at just under 1 inch at the yokote. The distal taper is consistent throughout, starting at 7.2 millimeters down to 5 millimeters at the yokote. And the blade features tori-sori, measuring at about 1/2 inch. Now there's a lot going on with the blade on this katana. Let's start with the fact that it is made of folded steel. Now unfortunately, I don't know what steels it was made with, but you can tell that it's folded because the pattern is pretty apparent. I believe they used some kind of acid etch on it, but I think it was a pretty light acid etch because it doesn't really have those dark lines that you typically see on acid enhanced hata. But one of the reasons I think that is the case is because there are a few spots where there are some dark lines where maybe the acid was left on a bit longer than intended and created that darker edge. When you look closely at it, you can definitely see one line through the entire blade that is brighter and more prominent than the rest of the hara. And it almost looks like a sanmai construction. From what I understand, this is not sanmai, but it looks like it. Now, the folded steel does not really replicate the true appearance of a tamahagane katana made from iron, sand, and smelted down, all that entire traditional business. It doesn't look like that, but it does give you a lot more to look at when you're admiring the blade. There's a lot of detail that you can look at that really makes the katana pop more. And the katana is differentially hardened. That means they took clay and applied it to the spine and the back half of the blade in order to affect how the sword is quenched so that the spine cools off at a different rate than the edge and ends up being softer than the very hard edge. Because it's differentially hardened, that means that the hamon on here is real. And they did a good job with this hamon. It's mostly straight, so it's a Seguha style hamon, but it's also polished pretty nicely. It's got a nice milky appearance to it, which is something that is, generally speaking, the way hamon were polished. And it's something else that you don't really see that much from production katana. And one of the other things I like about it is you can see that they tried to bring out details in the hamon. It's not just a simple, even polish. There, if you look closely, you can see places where it brings out the hara, especially at the edge of the hamon where it transitions into the rest of the blade. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Z-Sey has developed a reputation of one of the companies that produces the best polishes on katana in the production market. And this sword definitely has a better polish than the majority of katana that I have seen, but it definitely doesn't seem to be up to their standards of what they post and what I've seen people buy recently. Now, that probably means that this is one of the areas that they have improved on. You know, this is not, like I said, it's not up to their standards, but it's still a good polish. To explain what I mean by not quite up to their standards, there's two things I can really point at. One is those little dark lines that I mentioned earlier that look like they were from acid sitting on the blade a bit longer than intended. The second thing is if you look at the shinogi-ji, that's the part of the blade between the mune, the spine, and the ridge here where it starts the transition to the edge bevel. This part right here is polished brightly, which is nice. You do want to see that. But if you look close, you can see grind lines in it. And that's something that could be cleaned up more. Now, I don't expect them to do hand stones, you know, the traditional togishi style of polishing a katana. That's a very laborious process, very time consuming, and hence very expensive. That's not reasonable to expect in a sword priced at $800 to $900. But they could still clean up those grind lines a bit more. One area that they did a really good job on is the kasaki. The yakote is geometric, not cosmetic, which means the geometry of the blade changes into the kasaki. That's how it's defined, and that's correct, and again, something that's missing on a lot of katana. In addition, you can tell it's got a different polish on it. A lot of lower cost katana, they'll just polish in a different direction on the kasaki than the rest of the blade, creating kind of a different look. This one looks like it's actually been burnished some differently to give it a different appearance, which is good. In addition, the hamon, or the boshi in the kasaki, does the correct thing and kind of wraps around towards the back of the kasaki. That's, again, something you don't see nearly as often, and it shows a lot of attention to detail that Z-Sey put into the blade overall, but little things like that are a good sign for the craftsmanship and the attention to detail. And if you look down the lengths of the blade, there's some very, very minor rippling, especially on the shinogi-ji, but it's almost impossible to see. I couldn't capture it on camera, and at least I don't think I could. Maybe you'll see it in this video. I couldn't, but I can definitely feel it if I run my fingers along it. Now, if you look down the spine, there you can definitely see some rippling with the way it reflects light. Hopefully this footage captures it. And if I run my fingers along that, definitely feel those ripples a lot more. This could be improved. It's not a big deal, but it is something that could be improved overall. And the edge beveling is outstanding here, which you tend to expect from a Longchuan katana. It's the Chinese katana makers do a great job, generally speaking, of shipping swords that are not only properly beveled with one smooth bevel, no secondary bevel, but they ship them sharp. And this is no exception to that. Taking a look at some cutting footage. Now, I didn't do a ton of cutting with this sword because I didn't really buy it to be a cutter. I bought it because I wanted a really attractive katana, and I think this fits the bill. That said, I don't really have swords that I will never cut with. So I did do some. I did water bottles and one tatami mat. I didn't do pool noodles because pool noodles tend to leave more scuffs than I expect on blades, especially blades with a good high polish. And I didn't want those scuffs on here. So water bottles and tatami. With water bottles, it cuts them very well, as you would expect from the sharpness. One thing I can say is when I first started cutting with this, I was not getting the best cuts and the katana didn't feel that great in the hand. And then I realized I was holding it wrong. I had it angled slightly and I was getting my edge alignment off. And the Tsuka was telling me that because I was like, this doesn't feel quite comfortable enough. And once I corrected that, it started slicing through targets with aplomb. So the katana gave me the feedback to correct my poor technique, which is something you really like to see in any sword, really. So this is capable of delivering both powerful cuts and more lighter, nimble cuts. And when I took it to a milk jug covered in a old t-shirt, it cut through almost all of the way through. I think it probably would have got through all the way if I hadn't cut through the cap. In addition, I think I need to, on these kinds of targets, do something to support the back end of the cloth. Don't just leave it dangling over, because it's not really representative of how cloth would be worn. I mean, this is not really an analog for any kind of real target, but I like to see how well it can cut cloth, because cloth is relatively difficult to cut. So I think in the future, I'm probably going to try to tuck it under the target, something like that, and see if swords can cut all the way through the cloth. With tatami, if you're familiar with my reviews, you probably can predict what I'm going to say here. When my edge alignment is on, cuts right through, no problems. When it's off, not so much. And since I am still very much a work in progress with cutting, I definitely had more than my fair share of cuts where my edge alignment was off. That said, there was one cut where I kind of ended up scooping midway through the cut, and it still got all the way through, which surprised the heck out of me, honestly. And when I didn't have great cuts, you can see, especially in the slow motion, the sword cuts in, and when it stops the cut or when it's off an angle, the sword's flexing quite a bit. This is always a little bit scary for a differentially hardened sword because they tend to take sets when they are flexed like that because they're not spring steel. They're not designed to be that, to not take a set. That's one of the ideas behind a differentially hardened sword. It's generally speaking very rigid, but at the same time, if it does flex, since the spine is soft, it's more likely to take a set. All that being said, this katana didn't take a set. It's perfectly straight, and my relatively poor cuts on the tatami did not cause any issues for it at all. So this katana weighs in at 2 pounds, 7 ounces, but it feels like it has a bit more heft to it than that. And that's probably because it is balanced right around 5 inches from the munemachi, which is fine for a katana. That's a decent place to be, but it is a little further out than you'll sometimes see on reproduction katana, katana in the mass market, which tend to favor more like around 4 inches. So this feels just a little bit more forward heavy, a little bit more authoritative in the cut than I'm used to for a katana. But I actually really like how it feels because it gives you that sense of authority in the cut. And part of that is probably because this does not have a bohi, so it doesn't reduce the weight the way a bohi does. And the overall taper on it, it does start, and the profile taper thins out a little bit towards it, and it does the distal taper as well. So it has, like I said, just a really good feel to the authority in the cut. The way the blade moves out there is really nice and easy to control while still having, like I said, a good amount of authority in the cut. I actually really do like the way this sword handles more than I expected it to like it. So, I tend to through my sword journey, I have tended to really prefer the Anakubi Zukuri katana geometry because of how light and nimble they are. This sword and a few others have really started to change my opinion on that. I really do like the authority gives me in the cut and just the overall heft to it. It doesn't feel heavy, but it feels there. It has blade presence and really does feel really nice. And I do also really like the way the Ito feels in the hand. I talked about the fact that it's a little looser than I think it should be and compared it to the Huawei that I had rewrapped by Cottontail Customs. And this is certainly nowhere near as good of a wrap as he put it on. But even though it is looser than I would like, I've never had any hesitation about the way it feels when I'm moving it. I don't feel like the Minuki are very slightly looser than I would like, but when I'm using it, I don't notice it. And that's really the most important thing because it doesn't detract my confidence in using the katana. But continuing on with how the leather feels, it has this slightly tacky grip that is really, really comfortable. And it's not like the feel of leather on a European sword with that style of wrap. It's a very different feel. It's very slightly tacky, very slightly grippy. I really feel like when I grip it, I feel like I have a really strong grip on this. I really do like the leather they used here. I will say this knot right here, the top one, is a tiny bit of a hot spot. My finger sometimes catches on it just a little bit when I'm moving it around and just kind of rubs it a little bit. It's not painful. It just kind of has a little bit of rubbing to it that I think over the course of using it for a while could start to really rub my finger raw a little bit. But I don't think it's that big of a deal. I honestly think just more use of this is probably going to wear it down before my finger wears down. So I think that would take care of itself with more use, honestly. And I mentioned earlier the confidence I have in the sword. And one thing I can say is none of the hilt furniture is loose. Yeah, the Minuki are slightly loose, but the Fuchi, the koshirae, the Tsuba, all of them are rock solid. And that is so good to feel. It keeps me feeling like like the sword is not going to let me down. It's not going to come loose. And it's something that you don't see often on lower price swords. Most of the time, these lower price swords, the hilt furniture starts coming loose pretty quickly after just, one or two cutting sessions. I can start feeling wiggle in most katana hilt furniture, most koshirae. Not the case here. Even when I had some bad cuts on tatami, no problems at all. So when I try to get sword wind out of this sword, tachikaze, I struggle a lot. You can hear during this footage, it's there, and it's actually pretty audible in this footage. However, when I do it myself, I can't hear that. I only heard the sword wind after I went back and reviewed my footage. When I was actually swinging it, I couldn't hear it at all. So to me, that's not very useful tachikaze. That's not giving me the feedback when I'm using it. That's giving me feedback afterwards when I review the footage, which is still somewhat useful, but nowhere near as much as when you swing it and getting that immediate feedback that your edge alignment is on. So for my first comparison, here I have the Z-Sey, and here I have a Sheng Sword Shobuzukuri katana. I chose this one as one of my comparisons because it has no bow key. It's a Shobuzukuri, so the tip geometry is a little bit different, but they are relatively similar. This weighs 2 pounds 9 ounces, 2 pounds 7 ounces, so pretty similar. And if you can compare the blades and the hilts right here, you can see that they're pretty similar overall. Now this shank sword is certainly less expensive than the Z-Sey, but not as much as I would expect, honestly. This is, I believe, around $500 if you tried to order it now. And I'm going to ignore a lot of the problems I have with this sword. You can check out the review in the description and just talk about how they feel. So one of the things about this shank sword is that the blade has so much more heft to it than the hilt. The hilt feels really lightweight and it's balanced. Honestly, what's weird about that is it's balanced, I think, a little bit closer than the Z-Sey, but the Z-Sey doesn't have that feel of the hilt being too lightweight, which I think this sword does have. And the Ito wrap on here certainly doesn't feel as nice and as tacky as the leather on the Z-Sey. And I say tacky, and it feels like I'm saying something bad there, and I'm not. I really like the feel of the leather. So if you're interpreting tacky as bad, don't. I think it's really good. It's grippy. It feels good in the hand. This is a cotton wrap, I believe, and feels pretty much like most cotton wraps. So when I move this around, it does have, like I said, it feels more blade heavy than the Z-Sey, and looking at it right here, it looks to me like it gets thinner than the Z-Sey. It has quite a bit of distal taper to it, and yet it still feels blade heavy and just not quite right. There's something about this sword that just doesn't quite feel right, and whereas the Z-Sey feels perfect. And for the other comparison, here's my Z-Sey, and here's my customized Huawei. Now I need to say right up front, these are two very different katana. One's Anakubi, one is Shinogi Zukuri, and this one on top of that has been pretty heavily customized with a new wrap, new Tsuba, and new Minuki, and new Samagawa as well. So it's not your typical Huawei Anakubi Zukuri katana. So the handling is going to be a little different. The Tsuka was shortened a little bit when it was customized as well. But since I've talked about Anakubi Zukuri here and I've talked about the leather wrap on here, I figured I should do a comparison of them. And to really drive home how different these katana feel, the Z-Sey weighs 2 pounds 7 ounces, this weighs 2 pounds 2 ounces. And boy, do you feel that when you pick them up. 5 ounces doesn't sound like a lot, but this, you pick it up, it feels like a feather in your hand. It feels like you can feel the blade out there, but it just feels so light, nimble, and easy to move around. And like one-handed, it feels more natural one-handed than pretty much any katana I've used. And so the leather wrap, this is, like I said, done by Cottontail Customs. It's not as tacky and grippy as the Z-Sey. It's a very different feel. The knots are rock solid and there's no hot spots up on them at all. It doesn't have quite the grippy feeling, the tacky feeling that the Z-Sey has that I actually really like on there. But I like the way this feels too. It's a different feel. It's a little bit harder, a little bit more slippery because it's not, that tackiness isn't there, that grippiness. So that said though, I do really love the way this feels. And because it is Anakubi Zukuri, it's just so light and nimble and easy to move around. So overall, I do really like the handling of this katana. I think it is a really good feeling katana that has a lot of authority in the cut, but still moves around very, very well. I think the primary problem I have with the Ito wrap is that I think it's not going to be durable enough. I love the way it feels. I think it feels great. It's very effective. But with it being this loose on a $700-800 sword, I don't think it's going to last unless I took the time to lacquer it maybe, and then that would kind of ruin that tacky, grippy feeling to it. So if this were a tighter Ito wrap, it would be a much better Ito wrap. looking at potential improvements that could be made on this sword. This might not be particularly applicable because, as I mentioned earlier, Z-Sey has already said that they have made improvements since making this sword. But I figured it doesn't hurt to point out the top few things, my biggest complaints about this sword. And I'm going to say they're pretty minor. First off, the Ito wrap. While I love the way it feels and it's effective, I think it's a little too loose, and I'm a little concerned with its durability because of that looseness. I could see this loosening up more over time and needing a rewrap sooner than it should on a sword that's $700-800. Secondly would be the polish on the sword. It's better than a lot you'll see on the market, but it's also still got some rough spots to it, especially on the shinogi near the spine where you can see the grind lines in it. Now, Z-Sey is widely known as one of the makers that has the best polish on the market these days, so I think this is something they've already fixed. Lastly, on the saya, while I like the profile of the saya, the fit's pretty good, at this price point, buffalo horn really should be included for the koiguchi and kujiri, just to give it that little bit of extra protection for those who practice iaito and draw cuts and things like that. And also just because it looks nicer than just a wood koiguchi and kojiri, putting in that buffalo horn just brings it a little bit better and gives it that more premium look and feel, which at this price point, it really should have. Bottom line, this sword would have cost you around $800 to $900 if you were able to buy it when it was available. In fact, let's just say $900 just to put it at the top end of what I think it probably costs new. What did you get for that price? Well, you get a katana that has a beautiful folded steel pattern. You get one that has a very nice and very attractive polish on it that is a lot better than you will typically see on Longchuan katana. That said, there are still some areas that could be improved in the polish. You get a Ito wrap that, I love the leather feel here. I love the way it feels. And the Tsuka core is well designed and well shaped. Unfortunately, the Ito is a little looser than it should be. You get attention to detail that you don't normally see on reproduction katana. You get a habaki that fits the blade very well. You get kasaki with proper boshi and just a lot of attention to detail that really makes the katana more than the sum of its parts. And that includes the mounting. Sure, the Ito wrap could be a little bit tighter, but the rest of the mounting is excellent. There's absolutely no looseness in anything but the Minuki, but the Fuchi, the Koshirae, the Suba, the Habaki, the Seppa, they're all nicely solid, nicely tight, and the transitions from the Ito to the Fuchi and Koshirae are perfect as well. So you get a katana that has a lot of attention to detail. So was it worth that price of $900? Well, I didn't pay that price, but I didn't pay that far off that price. And yes, I think it is worth that price. I think this is an absolutely gorgeous katana that handles really, really well, feels really good in the hand, is a very good backyard cutter, even if I'm not going to use it like that. And sure, there are a very few downsides. The Ito wrap being a little bit loose, the saya not having buffalo horn, koiguchi, kojiri, and kurigata, the polish that could be very slightly improved. These are minor things in the overall picture. And I think the best way to put it is I do not regret the price I paid for this katana. If I had paid the full price, I would not regret it. And really, that's what my reviews are, is do I feel like what I got, the sum total, is worth the price that I paid or worth the price that they are asking for it, since I get a lot of my swords secondhand. And yes, I think in this case, it absolutely was worth that price. Now, unfortunately, I can't recommend this model because it's not available. However, Z-Sey does have a few other models in this general price range. They don't have folded steel from what I've seen, but the improvements they've made in the polish, and I believe in the mounting, especially the Ito wrap, at least from what I've seen of their pictures and what other people have reported about new or bought Z-Seys, I think those probably outweigh the lack of the folded steel. And you can still get the folded steel, you just have to pay some more for it. So, like I said, I can't recommend this katana because it's not available. But my experiences with it say to me that I can recommend Z-Sey. This sword has impressed me quite a bit. And if Z-Sey still has swords in this general price range that are improved, that's a really good sign and something that the market could really use. So I think Z-Sey is absolutely worth the shot.